All right, so at this point, we've all got hidden details, Easter eggs, and Arcane Season 2 theories coming out of our ears. But what if I told you that the most shockingly brilliant Jungian and philosophical message in Arcane Season 2 has not been covered by anyone? I don't know how this is possible. Maybe I missed it. Let me know if I have. The writing is steeped in archetypal symbols and deep, meaningful philosophy that's clearly sending a specific message to the world about you, about me, about us. It's about the war within the mind and the beauty in ascension that only comes through duty, suffering, descent into the abyss, and death. As we harrow our own personal hell individually, societally, and metaphysically. It solidifies in my mind how brilliant the writers of Arcane actually are. But anyways, let's start in the East with the philosophy of beauty in imperfection and sacrifice. So did you notice the repeated emphasis of Kintsugi, right? The Japanese art invented to practice the philosophy of wabi-sabi, beauty in imperfection. This wabi-sabi teaches us to value the old and worn over the new, and the imperfect over the ideal, to see beauty in imperfection. We see this philosophy in the repaired table and the gold on Mel's skin as well, especially when she discovers that she is a mage. What is the hidden message here? Beauty and imperfection, yes, but in light of Viktor's attempts to create a new utopian world without pain and suffering, it's far more. It's a philosophy, in fact, that takes us back to the West, to Heraclitus, Socrates, and Carl Jung.
Incredible. What I wouldn't give to glimpse the world through your eyes, to know what you know.
Knowledge is a paradox. The more one understands, the more one realizes the vastness of his ignorance.
Socrates shows how knowledge is a paradox, right? By saying, the more I know, the more I realize I know nothing. This is a key message from Viktor, right? Opening up a dialogue pointing back to the West.
To complete your work, to save us from ourselves, must survive, Viktor.
Do you believe in fate, Doctor?
Not fate, evolution, nature's greatest force.
No, evolution has a destination, not to combat nature, but to supersede it. The final, glorious evolution.
Do you believe in fate? This fate and evolution they speak of points to the Western belief in the Logos. Heraclitus, the Stoics, Philo of Alexandria, on the Jewish side of things, the Neoplatonists, the Christians, Heidegger, and many others, all believed that the Logos pervades the universe. It's like a force maintaining its rational order, a force or or God himself, right? If you're a Christian, this Logos can be seen as the invisible hand guiding the natural and moral laws that structure existence. Something like a magnet force, bringing together the opposites, seeking to join them in the alchemical conjunctio oppositorum, right? The hieros gamos, the union of opposites, right? Keeping in mind that the proper joining of the opposites brings true beauty and life into the world. Right, so think of the infant, the new human created by the union of male and female, or the universally recognized beauty of the sunset or sunrise as the day, right, the realm of the sun meets night, the realm of the moon. Arcane Season 2 has many instances of opposites joining, like the joining of the Council of the Elites, and Zon, right, the systematically disadvantaged underbelly of Piltover, foreshadowed by the joining of blue and pink in Jinx's colors, and so many other things. But this is only a small part of the message, believe it or not.
Do you believe in fate, Doctor?
Not fate, evolution, nature's greatest force.
Is Viktor speaking mythologically or psychologically, speaking of the three archetypal fates, perhaps? Maybe. But I think he's speaking about something closer to the Stoic or Christian logos, while Singed refers to a Darwinian evolutionary force using Heraclitean language, as Heraclitus described the logos using fire as its symbol, explaining that the logos is in perpetual flux, perpetual change, flux, becoming. He said, "You never step into the same river twice." Evolutionary force and the logos, or this metaphysical fate, to Viktor, are one and the same. And its purpose is not to combat nature, but to supersede, to transcend it, much like the old Christian concept of superseding, transcending the old self and becoming the new self, which is said to be joined with God through the process of theosis or sanctification. So that this new creature is no longer merely human, as Paul indicates in 1 Corinthians 3:4, or 3:3 and 3:4. Victor's idea of transcending nature is somewhat similar, but flawed. Right? He attempts to become a God of compassion, essentially, that takes away the suffering of the world. But he's realizing how flawed this idea, as beautiful as it seemed to him, is. The more I know, the more I realize I know nothing, right? He's beginning to see his shortcomings. But these are just the little pieces. Let's get to the core of the message written in gold images. And then lastly, we'll fully explain the biggest message in Victor's arc. So one big part of the message hidden in Arcane Season 2, as we've discussed in part, is that imperfection and suffering are a necessary part of the world. And there's a hidden beauty in those things. But it's so much more. They go as far as showing you how you cannot have a good world with free will, choice, and many forms of good without them. We'll explain that fully in a moment. But to set that up, let's talk about the gold in Arcane Season 2. What are the gold lines that we see all over the place, right? And the most obvious of which is the broken and repaired table, as far as the connection goes to Kintsugi, but also the gold on Mel's back and neck, which glows, right? It glows with a magical power. And the gold that lights up the chains when she breaks free and becomes a mage, right? She breaks free from LeBlanc. And the golden paint she paints over memories of her former home's bloody past. What do these things represent? So first things first, one of the most widely accepted theories is that Mel is possibly a descendant of the Solari and a Solarian, a religious order that worships the sun, and the gold on her skin is an artifact of the sun and with the power of the sun. But let's dig into the Jungian side of things a bit. If you know anything about Jungian symbols, and just symbolism in general, right? Biblical, scriptural, Jungian or otherwise, the sun has a very deep, powerful message, as it is the symbol of God himself. It is the symbol of the self, archetypally speaking. The sun has long been associated with the divine, the heavenly, that which is above, giving life to that which is below, right? Think of the golden rays of the sun. They're life-giving to the earth below, healing psychologically through vitamin D, for example. Places like Seattle, that get less sun, have higher suicide rates for this reason. But also, think of the plants that we eat and use to mend wounds, right? The plants, the cows, chicken, sheep, and other animals that we eat to live, right? That we survive on, they die without the sun. And we die without the plants and the animals. So the sun is life and healing, right? It's symbolic of that for a reason. It's common sense, basically. This is why Christ is closely associated with the sun and light in the scriptures, and his spirit with fire, just like the Heraclitean logos. There's a reason Christ as the logos is the center of reality, as the sun is the center of our solar system. This gold, I believe, is a clear nod to the Japanese art Kintsugi in part. This is the art invented specifically to practice wabi-sabi again, right? Beauty in imperfection and brokenness. Repairing broken pottery by mending the breakage with lacquer of gold. We see this most clearly in the repaired table here. And notice how the shattered table is repaired with gold. It's mended with gold, given new life, in the same way that we can mend our souls, according to Jung and according to the Bible as well, right? More on that in a moment. But let's talk about Mel. Keep in mind the psychological, emotional wounds and suffering Mel experiences with the rejection of her mother and her getting banished, exiled from her homeland, and much more besides. All her pain and suffering culminates in the agony of being bound by thorned chains by LeBlanc. Notice the resemblance here to the suffering of Christ, by the way. All right, she has something resembling a crown of thorns on her head, but also her body is torn and rent like Christ's scourging. And like Christ, she metaphysically ascends and later is able to save people through the power that only comes to her through the very pinnacle of suffering. Also, notice the wing-like golden power emanating off of her back at the end, right? Symbolizing her transcendence, perhaps, her metaphysical ascension into her magehood, or whatever you would call that. One of the many metaphysical symbols the Arcane writers are so adept at wielding. Also, notice how the chains have lost their thorns. This is beautiful symbolism. It brings to mind the similar outcome in Christ's victory on the cross over sin and death, right? O death, where is thy victory? O death, where is thy sting? Mel, like Viktor, Jace, and Jinx, is portrayed as a broken, partial type of Christ, an imperfect human post-figuration, perhaps, of Christ in their great suffering, altruism, savior arc, their descent and then ascension of some form or another, and self-sacrifice. The best stories often reveal this archetype, by the way, right? I'm not saying that Arcane is a clearly Christian message, Christian story. This is, just any strong story. Well, most strong stories have some overlap with the story of Christ, from ancient to modern. We see types of imperfect Christ figures in Odin, Horus, Dionysus, Zarathustra, and many, many others. But the main point here is that Mel only achieves her overwhelming magical power when she descends to the very depths of suffering and transcends it. This is relatable because it's an ever-repeating motif in our own lives at various levels. And, well, especially in the most devastating seasons of our lives, right? To ascend, you must first descend. And suffering is the refining fire for the soul, essentially, right? That brings us back to Jung. Carl Jung emphasized that true psychological growth and individuation, or wholeness, essentially psychological, come from confronting and integrating, all right, mending, you could also say, our deepest flaws and sufferings. Much like the art of Kintsugi repairs broken pottery by embracing its cracks and imperfections with the gold lacquer. Ernesto Cardinal said, "Even my pain is God's loving gift." The 14th century German mystic Meister Eckhart echoed this, pointing to the way suffering can link us to the divine, the logos, or the self from a Jungian perspective. When he wrote, "God is always with a man in suffering. When this occurs, we are lifted up out of our distress through an experience that leaves us feeling touched by a miracle." These types of miracles are portrayed in Arcane in Mel's ascent into her true mage self, and Jace and Viktor's self-sacrifice that saves the world. Keep in mind, all of this will become a lot more relevant when we get to Viktor's not-so-utopian utopia. This is the most important part of this story and the clearest part of this message. Jung said, "Suffering that is not understood is hard to bear, while on the other hand, it is often astounding to see how much a person can endure when he understands the why and wherefore." This brings to mind Nietzsche's famous proverb, of course, "He who has a why to live for can bear almost anyhow." How many of us deliberately take up our suffering, even seemingly meaningless, pointless suffering, confront it, and integrate it on a regular basis, mending our soul with golden psychic energy, or perhaps even the logos, the pneuma, spirit, from a Christian perspective, and true power, All right, psychic energy is what Carl Jung called libido, by the way, which not a sexual libido, but a vital force, essentially. And how often do we instead run away from our suffering, hide, repress it, pretend like it's not even there until it boils over out of the unconscious into our conscious lives in an uncontrollable, self-destructive outburst? The main characters in Arcane face suffering heroically, and it shapes them like God's smithy hammer for the soul. Ultimately, their descent into the dark abyss of suffering leads to their ascent. Right? Mel to her true magical power and status as a powerful mage. Jinx, in her own way, transcends into the greatest love in reality as she sacrifices her life to save her sister. Echo saves the world, suffering over and over and over again before finally getting to Viktor, hitting him hard enough to snap him out of the utopia-seeking, world-destroying God mode he was in. And because of Echo, Viktor and Jace are able to transcend the material world completely to heroically save the world by apparently sacrificing themselves, embodying, like Jinx, the greatest love imaginable. These are brilliant lessons for life. Beyond the obvious practical use of suffering as an indicator that something is wrong, meaningful suffering also makes true happiness possible. Jung says, happiness is itself poisoned if the measure of suffering has not been fulfilled. In other words, true happiness comes not from the avoidance of suffering, but meeting it head on, listening to the lessons it holds, learning and integrating, transcending it. Again, ascending into the kingdom of heaven, psychologically and metaphysically, only comes through first descending into the depths of suffering and chaos, which is potential. There's no real growth, no great success in life without pain. Also, would we even be able to identify joy or happiness if we've never experienced suffering or sadness? We need these dualities, and for various reasons. And last but not least, suffering is a psychic mover, as Mokanin calls it. It fuels our creativity and drives us to seek meaning, confront inner conflicts, and integrate different aspects of the psyche. To transcend, in other words, like Viktor did, finally, in the end. And the more intense our suffering, the more of our psyche is activated, which ignites that inner spark of creativity. This is why some of the world's greatest artists live lives filled with pain and suffering and emotional turmoil. But this is the bottom line. Carl Jung, like the writers of Arcane and many of the greatest thinkers in history, saw suffering and traumatic life changes as opportunities for deeper self-understanding and transformation. Transformation, that is, into a more ideal version of you. Now let's scale up to the societal and cosmic level even, where we see Viktor pulling metaphysical strings to shape the ideal utopian world. There's an ancient philosophical message behind Viktor's failure to create a perfect world without pain, without suffering. It's a very deep philosophy with roots in our ancient past, branching into fruits into our modern world, both in the West and in the East. And this is the biggest message that Arcane Season 2 has to offer. And it is essentially life, humanity. It's messy. It's ugly. It's broken. It's deeply painful. And those are precise, indispensable ingredients for beauty and good. In fact, you can't have the specific forms of beauty and good that we see in our world without the brokenness, the imperfections, the pain. So let's dig into that message communicated through Viktor's arc. Viktor, even as an ascended, supremely powerful God, essentially, fails to create an ideal world without pain and suffering. That is, he succeeds in eliminating pain and suffering, but at the cost of love, happiness, joy, and choice, and freedom. free will, agency. And the philosophical theory behind this is that it is truly impossible, even for an all-powerful, omniscient God, to create the world Viktor initially wanted. That is, one free of pain and suffering where everyone has choice, free will, and a world filled with the goods that we know and appreciate. Bear in mind the answer to the question, can God create a rock that is too heavy for him to lift? The answer is, of course, that this is a logical paradox, right? Omnipotence does not mean the ability to do the logically impossible. Viktor later calls it the field of dreamless solitude, right? Because there's no dreaming. There's no hope for the future. He says, there is no prize to perfection, only an end to pursuit. And it is in pursuit that we find purpose, meaning, and thus joy and fulfillment. Pursuit of the highest good, right? The logos, the self, God. And this purpose is meaningful in part because of the possibility and inevitability of failure, pain, and death. Imagine a world where you get everything you pursue without any pain, without any failure. You set a goal to get a six-pack, do one painless crunch, and boom, there you go. You've got it. You go fishing in pursuit of a trophy smallmouth bass, let's say. First cast, you land a trophy. Second cast, another trophy. Third cast, and you guessed it, yet another trophy. By the 20th trophy bass, you realize this isn't heaven at all. This is hell. It is meaningless, boring, purposeless hell. This is precisely what we see in Viktor's utopia in a different way. He succeeds in creating a world without pain and suffering, but it is a bleak dystopian hellscape of tyranny void of freedom, love, joy, courage, or any of the virtues, unless you consider forced virtue. All of the best things life has to offer are ultimately destroyed in a world without pain and suffering. Better still, they end with Viktor and Jace saving the world by sacrificing themselves in a heroic, Christ-like act of love. And this sacrifice, and all the sacrifices and suffering they've all gone through up to this point, culminate in this beautiful joining of the opposites. The elite members of the council and Zahn, the lowly underclass of Piltover, are joined together, right? They rebuild. They put the pieces together. They put the represented by that table, pieces joined together with that golden glue or lacquer, and they become stronger, more balanced, wiser, and whole. We suspect, at least, two worlds joined together. Jace and Viktor saving the world together in their sacrifice brings a quote from the East to mind. Duty is as heavy as a mountain, but death is light like a feather. Perfection, as Viktor says, is not a prize, only an end to one of the most meaningful things we have access to, the pursuit, the journey, life. So consider the following as the end. Irenaeus claims that God allowed suffering and evil into the world because it's not possible to have free will without them, and as a means of moral and spiritual development. In other words, pain exists to bring about a higher good or to enhance the good, right? It's easy to understand at lower levels where pain alerts you to the fact that something is wrong, something is not quite right, and so you want to avoid that thing, which brings about a higher good, right, of not getting hurt, essentially. We can understand the concept of no pain, no gain, right? That which does not kill me makes me stronger. We go to the gym to put ourselves through pain and suffering for a higher purpose, right? To enhance the good, which is our physical health, our strength, perhaps, our beauty, perhaps. In his work, Confessions, Augustine says that evil is the corruption or absence of good. If you allow people to choose good or reject it, the possibility for evil inevitably exists. He says that in the ideal world, in the sense of a perfect world without suffering, that could not exist without the loss of free will. He wrote, God judged it better to give men freedom, knowing that they would sin, knowing they would sin, and to bring good from it, than not to give men freedom in the first place. God allowed suffering and evil into the world for both of those reasons, and as a means of moral and spiritual development, right? So it's the idea that God uses pain and suffering in the same way that a blacksmith uses a hammer, but instead of a sword, it's for our souls, right? The pain and suffering is God's smithy hammers for our hearts and souls. The potential for moral growth, free will, and the development of virtues like love and courage can only arise if humans are allowed to face real challenges in life and choose freely. So pain and suffering are like a refiner's fire, or again, like a blacksmith's hammer, or the intense pressure and molten heat of the Earth's mantle, which produces diamonds from carbon. And that is the beautiful hidden message in Arcane, Season 2. If you enjoyed this video, please like it, subscribe, helps the channel a lot. I appreciate it if you do, and I will see you in the next one.